Hey y'all, what's going on? I've been gone for 2 weeks. I've been busy. I've worked 14 days or so, 10, 12 hours a day. I think I'm finally done. I'm going to pour myself into this podcast over the next few months. Recording audio books. Got some announcements on that coming up. I'll let you know when they're available, if you even care. But I've enjoyed doing them so much. And one report, I finished off my Yeti Bar Lemonade Stand soap bar, and it is great. It doesn't have a real strong scent, but it smells good. Now I'm using the Glacier Bar, and I love that. And I just want to mention that I think women would enjoy these two bars, Lemonade Stand and the Glacier Bar. And there's also violets, and there's other scents that women would like. And I just thought I'd mention that. Go check out Yeti Bar Soap at yetibars.net and check them out on Yeti Bars at Facebook. Use the code DC10 at checkout, get a 10% discount. I wasn't going to do a podcast today. I was going to go fishing, even though I hadn't put a podcast up in 2 weeks. But when I woke up, it was pouring raining. And by 10 o'clock, it was still raining. So I unhooked my boat, came out here to the office, and I'm going to work on podcasting all day. I'm going to try to do 2 or 3 for the upcoming week, get them ready as I go. But right now, I've got one story. I'll tell you about it when we get to it. Hope you like it. All right, here we go. All right. One long story. I think you guys will enjoy this. I hope you do. It's, well, just let me read it. I'm going to read his whole email, everything from front to back, except a little note at the end that's just between he and I, and it's just a discussion of what he thinks or some of these encounters are and what they're not, and just his opinion. He said to keep it between you and me, and that's what I'm going to do. But I'm going to read his whole email here. His name is Jason. He lives in North Carolina, and he writes, I'm self-employed and much of my time is spent alone in my shop doing work that can often be monotonous. I'm constantly searching for something to keep me entertained, and a few weeks ago I stumbled across your channel. I enjoyed immensely, and I've already listened to every video several times. Whoa. Man, thank you. I really appreciate that, and I'm glad you like it, Jason. It seems you are an avid reader, so I've included with this letter 2 books that I'm certain you will enjoy. If you already own them, pass them on to whomever you see fit. Jason, I owned one, and I read the other, and I gave a copy of, I gave one each to my grandsons, and when they get finished reading them, they're going to swap them up. I hope they read them. But he says, please accept the following account. It is true and has turned me from a disinterested skeptic into a thoroughly attentive fence sitter. All right, here we go. That's what he wrote. All right, here we go. Let me preface my story by saying that although I grew up in a suburb of Raleigh, North Carolina, I've always been a country boy at heart. My paternal grandparents had a farm in central North Carolina, and when I wasn't there, I wanted to be. There were rolling hills, creeks, and milo fields separated by tracts of hardwoods teeming with squirrels, rabbits, and quail. Some of the happiest times of my life were spent on this farm, roaming the woods, camping, hunting, and fishing. For a young boy who craved adventure, it was paradise. I would disappear into the woods for days. Back then, it simply wasn't a big deal for a young boy to go off camping by himself as long as his parents had a general idea as to where he would be and when he would return. Looking back, I was probably safer in the woods on my grandfather's farm than just about anywhere else. There were no dangerous animals in this part of the state, and the only things that caused concern were ticks, chiggers, and the occasional copperhead. When I wasn't playing Daniel Boone on the farm, I would often go on trips with my Boy Scout troop in the nearby Uwharrie National Forest. If you aren't familiar with it, this national forest is about 51,000 acres, with most of it in Montgomery County. I've hiked a considerable amount of this forest, sometimes willingly and sometimes begrudgingly due to a directionally challenged assistant scoutmaster who we who we nicknamed Lost Again Lewis. Lost Again Lewis. His shortcuts could turn a 5-mile day hike into a 20-mile overnight hike. I mention all this simply to establish that from an early age I would regularly spend time in the woods. I'm familiar with the local animals and I don't spook easily. Unfortunately, when relating a story such as this, you feel obligated to qualify yourself in order to preemptively silence some of the questions from armchair critics. I never understood why, but to me, a lot of the Uwharrie National Forest has a foreboding feel. There are places that even on a sunny day in winter, when all the leaves have fallen, seem unnaturally dark and sinister. Several books written by local folklorist Fred Morgan support this observation and contain many accounts of disconcerting and often violent events that have occurred in the area. In early March of 2012, I had some time off, decided to load up my old Land Rover and head out for a remote camping spot in the northwest Uwharries. I've always preferred to hike, hunt, fish, and camp alone. To me, the solitude is cathartic. To my delight, the campground I chose was completely deserted. There was a host site that contained an older travel trailer, but its condition indicated that it was abandoned. I selected a site at the very end of the loop road as far from the unoccupied trailer and as close to the dense woods as I could get. I planned on being there at least 4 or 5 days, so I set up my large 6-person Cabela's dome tent rather than my smaller backpacking tent. After eating supper, I decided to turn in early. It was already getting dark and I was bushed. I settled into my sleeping bag, turned off my lantern, and was very quickly fast asleep. Around midnight, I was awoken by a distant howl that my sleep-addled mind told me was probably a wolf, even though I knew there were no wolves in central North Carolina. In response to the cry, a pack of dogs began to bay. I lay still for a few minutes listening to all the racket, but soon it died down and all was quiet again. Having heard many odd noises while in the woods and being pragmatic, I chuckled to myself and tried to go back to sleep. My sixth sense was tapping me on the shoulder and saying that something wasn't exactly right, but I closed my eyes anyway. 10 to 15 minutes later, as I began to drift back to sleep, the howls repeated, and this time they were closer. Again, it was similar to the cry of a wolf, but the tone wasn't quite right. It was lower and deeper. The dogs again reacted with a chorus of yowling, but they still seemed farther away. They were reacting to the unknown caller, but they were not following it, or it had eluded them. At this point, I was a bit puzzled, but certainly not scared. It bothered me that I couldn't identify the animal that was making the yells, but I know for an absolute fact that there were no dangerous animals in this part of the state. Also, I had a pistol with me, and what were the odds that this animal, whatever it was, would come directly towards me into my camp? There was no chance at all, right? Again, I shrugged and I closed my eyes. This time, I fell to a deep sleep, a real comfortable sleep. 45 minutes later, I was jolted awake by a rumbling bellow that seemed right on top of me, and it was loud, very loud. My first thought, as I shook the sleep from my head, is that someone was outside my tent roaring at me through a bullhorn. It was so close, so unidentifiable, and so loud that I was immediately terrified. Even more disturbingly, as the scream slowly died out, it was replaced by heavy breathing and bipedal footsteps in the leaf litter heading towards my tent. I tried to convince myself that this must be a person playing a dangerous practical joke, but the steps were much, much too heavy. I remember having a bizarre thought that this prankster must be stomping around with anvils tied to their shoes. That absurd idea made me quickly realize that this was no prank. There was an exceptionally large and angry animal outside my tent, and I had no idea what it was. Sitting up, but still halfway in my sleeping bag, I slowly and quietly scooched to the middle of the large tent, ridiculously believing that somehow being in the center would provide some safety. I quietly grabbed my compact 9mm out of my duffel bag and slowly flipped off the safety, and I listened. When you're truly frightened, you feel flushed, your senses seem to sharpen, and time appears to slow. I could hear every leaf and twig that broke under the creature's feet as it approached. I also vividly recalled turning my head towards the oncoming noise, and with each footfall seeing small ripples being created in a half-empty bottle of water across the dark tent, exactly like in the first Jurassic Park movie. Options ran through my mind. I could yell out and hope that whatever this was would be startled and leave. I could step out of the tent and confront it, or I could remain quiet and see what happened. I had no idea what was outside, and I decided to sit still and wait. The footsteps were getting closer, but they slowed in pace. They stopped at what I guessed would be about 10 feet away from my tent. I had my pistol pointed in the thing's direction, and I was debating whether to fire off a couple of blind rounds through the tent wall. I'm conscious about gun safety and would normally never consider this, but abject terror can result in bad decisions. And in retrospect, I genuinely believe that had this creature taken another couple of steps toward me, I would have emptied the clip. Thankfully, it didn't. The animal was now standing still, and it began making an odd snuffling sound that led me to believe it was smelling the air. It reminded me of a pig grunting, only deeper, and it was always followed by a long and heavy exhale. The animal was a few feet outside, sniffing, grunting, and snorting, trying to determine its next step. And I'm sitting in the tent, sweating and horrified, with a death grip on my pistol. This went on for what seemed like several minutes, though more likely it was only 30 to 40 seconds. I was so tense that my arm holding the pistol began to shake, and I felt like I was going to hyperventilate. I felt that I was close enough to physical and mental breaking point, and I know that I desperately needed for this to end. After a few more frantic seconds of thought, I realized that for good or bad, I was going to have to try to take control of the situation. I resolved to quietly slip out of my sleeping bag, slit open the back of the tent, and jump out ready to shoot. I made some noise while trying to slide my legs out of the sleeping bag, and the animal let out a grunt that almost sounded like a question. There was an upward inflection at the end of the noise that made me think it might have been confused. Looking back, I believe it may not have been certain that I was in the tent until it heard me move. I froze, and for a few more seconds there was an absolute and terrifying silence. Then there was a deep and what I imagined to be a derisive grunt. It sounded like a bull snorting, but seemed to have an almost cynical tone. It then began to stomp off in the direction from which it came, grunting loudly with every other step. As the thing trudged off, I heard a loud cracking sound as if a large tree branch was being broken, and then another deafening roar, the sound of something being dragged in the leaves, and heavy footsteps continued to move away. I stayed perfectly quiet until I couldn't hear it any longer, and then I took a deep breath to relieve some of the stress in my body. I was still on alert, but slowly beginning to relax a little. After a few more minutes of silence, I decided that the animal was probably gone, but there was no way that I was going to spend the rest of the night in this flimsy nylon tent. I grabbed my car keys and stealthily unzipped the tent door to creep to my vehicle, pistol still in my hand. I figured I would drive to the closest town and find a well-lit parking lot and sleep in my car, and then tomorrow I would come back and collect my gear. So I fired up my Rover, turned on my headlights, and to my horror, there was a large tree limb about 10 feet in front of the truck blocking my exit. It was big enough that I didn't think I could drive over it without doing some significant damage to my vehicle. But it was not so large that I couldn't drag it partially out of the way and drive around it. I decided, however, that I was not going to get out of the car until daylight. So I turned off my lights, lowered my seat all the way back, rolled the window down about a half inch so I could hear, and I turned off the ignition. The rest of the night was a blur to me. I didn't go back to sleep, but there were times that I wasn't completely awake either. I would start to nod off, but my mind would not allow it. Thankfully, nothing else happened, and at first light, I was able to quickly break camp and move the tree branch enough to get my vehicle out. When I returned home, my wife immediately asked, "Why are you back so soon?" I didn't want to lie, but I simply couldn't figure out a way to explain what happened without sounding like a lunatic. So I just made up a story about not realizing that there was no cell service and that I didn't feel comfortable being out of touch for 4 or 5 days. Before this incident, I had no real interest in cryptids. However, I immediately began reading everything I could on them, focusing on reports from the Uwharrie region. To my great surprise, I found several accounts from this area, including a rather famous one. I learned that I was remarkably close to the sighting made by Michael Green, I think that's his name, who at the time was involved with the BFRO in North Carolina, and who had recorded thermal video of a humanoid figure snatching a candy bar from the top of a tree stump. At a family gathering not long afterwards, my maternal grandmother, who grew up just outside the northwest boundary of the forest, became upset when she was told I had been camping there alone. She said I shouldn't go there by myself. It was dangerous. And when I asked her why, she wouldn't give a straight answer. She would simply repeat, "Don't go there alone. You shouldn't go there alone ever." I'm still not convinced that I had an encounter with the hairy linebacker, but I don't know what animal walks on 2 feet, causes the ground to vibrate, and roars louder than a lion and breaks tree limbs. If you can come up with one, please let me know. However, I didn't actually see anything, and the more practical side of me believes that there must be a rational explanation. If it was a Bigfoot, then I'm glad I didn't see it, and I'm very happy not having an up-close image of that ugly mug in my head. The event alarmed me enough that I didn't go into the woods for a while, but I couldn't stay awake for long. I gave away my tents, I bought some larger guns, and eventually purchased a small travel trailer. When I'm out overnight, now I sleep like a baby. Maybe it's a false sense of security, but it works for me. I hope I didn't prattle on too much and keep up the good work. Kind regards, Jason. And then he has this between you and me. I could probably read it to you, but I just, it's pretty bland. It's not really, I don't think it's anything he wouldn't want you to hear, but he said between you and me, and that's where we're going to leave it. But, this is one of those stories that, how do you explain it? It's like the classic Bigfoot encounter. And I know this sounds cheesy, but these things, okay, here's the deal. I got an email this week. This is what's making me think about this. I got an email this week from a man, and he said, it was kind of a long exchange, and normally I don't have time to answer every email, but I had a few minutes and it came in, and so I immediately answered, and he said, tell me what you think about Bigfoot. And of course, you all have heard me say that I don't really have an opinion. I've never seen one. I've never seen any evidence of one. I've never seen a track. I've never seen a tree break that I couldn't write off as, something that blew off in a storm. I've smelled some weird things, but I write that off as something dead in the woods. It always smells like rotting flesh, like some animal crawled off in the wood and died. So I don't have any experience with these things, but the evidence that is most prevalent in my mind are these stories. And in these stories, these things are not aggressive. That was the man who emailed me, that was his question. Do you think they're I don't remember how he wrote it, but I'm paraphrasing. Do you think they're docile animals, or do you think they're aggressive? Do you think they're dangerous? Just standard questions like that. And my answer was, based on what I read, I don't think they're aggressive animals. There may be some, but it's a reaction. It's an instinctive action. And that's what animals do. And these things, I know a lot of people put human qualities on these animals or these beings or creatures, but you know what? They act just like an animal. I mean, based on these encounters that I read, and I've read hundreds of them on the podcast and just to myself as I kind of go through them, they don't seem to be at all aggressive. Now, and they act just like an animal. And in that, what I mean is, if you go into the woods, here in the Southeast United States, we don't really have dangerous animals in the woods. We can walk around without a gun anytime we want. I do all the time. I mean, in woods that I know and in strange woods. Went on a hike this weekend with some kids, and I wasn't in a real remote area, but I didn't have a gun with me. But if you walk off in the woods, say, for instance, where grizzly bears live, where do they live? Wyoming, Canada, way up in the Northwest. Black bears, too. If you walk up on one, they're generally just a little curious, or they're immediately scared and they run away. That they follow their instinct. Dogs, every animal on the planet except humans work on instinct. Food, procreation, fear, flight, fight. Everything is instinctive. These things act like animals. Their instinct is to be curious, or their instinct is to stay hidden, or their instinct is to approach and just check you out. And their instinct may also be to, if you're too close or if they have young around, they might charge you like a bear would do. They have similar behavior to a bear in this way. Now, this is coming from somebody who's a total layman, I'm not well read on animal behavior, but I watch animals all the time. And they're just instinctive animals. They work on basic instincts, the basic needs that every animal has. And I just listed them off. And at the end of the email, or in another exchange, he said, I've kind of decided not to go in the woods, or if I do, I'm real cautious. And of course I wrote back, and a lot of you know I don't know, what's the word? My position on that. It's not really a position. It's just my opinion. Don't be afraid of the woods. Guys, don't be afraid of the woods because of these stories. Get out there and enjoy the wild. And this is what I told the man. We live in one of the most beautiful continents in the world. We are so lucky to have such rich woodlands and forests and preserved forest, public and private. And it's beautiful, and it's full of wildlife. I know we've lost a lot of wildlife through the years, but there's still a lot of wildlife. I went out the other night, and I took a lawn chair back behind my house. I wasn't way out in the woods or anything, but I just went and sat in the woods and just listened to the night sounds. And I thought, I wish I'd have brought a recorder so I could share this with people. Just listen to what's going on. Just keep your eyes peeled. Look for any movement, any kind of movement. And it's usually a deer, a squirrel, a possum, a raccoon. Those are coyotes. We have coyotes. We have cur dogs that run around here. I love looking at the wildlife. So I'm going on and on. But I guess what I'm trying to say is, this is a classic encounter that to me is another bit of evidence that these things, their instinct is curiosity and flight and covering their trails and avoiding humans. I'm not going to say they're not dangerous, but based on everything I read, I would say 1 out of 100 you might have a little concern about, but it's not like they're lions hunting for food in Africa. If you get in a lion's territory, I could be wrong about this, but lions are a lot more aggressive. Tigers are way more aggressive than these these Bigfoots, or at least that's what it seems to me like in these stories. So anyway, I'm going on. I've been talking for 5 minutes about nothing, but it's just a great story. And Jason, thanks for sending it. Thanks for sending the books. My grandsons are going to enjoy them. And other people have sent me books through the last couple of years, and I know it may sound rude that I don't say anything about gifts that people send me, but I feel like that if I do, then people will send more. And I appreciate everything everyone has sent me, gifts and keepsakes and books. I bet I've gotten a dozen books from people over the last 3 years. I haven't read all of them. I don't say much about it because I don't want to encourage anyone to do. I don't want you spending a penny on me. I just want you to enjoy these stories. Okay, I probably should have done this in a live feed, but anyway, I'll shut up. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm going to knock out 3 or 4 podcasts for the week. And I'm back. I'm really excited to be doing this again. So we'll see you guys on the next video. Thanks.